Hey everybody, you're watching the Daily Dose of Poison. My name's Edward Hackett, and I'm going to be teaching you about different toxicological effects of various chemical compounds. Yay! Lots of science words. Alright, a couple weeks ago I got asked to do how caffeine affects your brain, so that's what I want to do today. What is caffeine? You know it, you love it, you drink it all the time. People have it every day with their morning coffee. It's in your energy drink that you're drinking before you're cramming for an exam. It's in the chocolate you're giving to your child. It's in the soda you give to your child. It is everywhere. So, what is it? I like to start off, since I'm a toxicologist, with the chemical structure. That's what caffeine looks like. Now, if you don't know, caffeine is basically a nitrogen alkaloid, meaning that it's got lots of nitrogens. That also means that's what gives it its bitter taste. So that deters animals and bugs from eating it, making it a great repellent in nature. That's why you commonly find it in plant seeds and different oils. Take a look at the structure really quick. You notice that it's got a 6-member ring with a double bond oxygen attached to it, meaning that that part is going to be fairly hydrophilic, or water-loving polar compound, meaning that it's a fairly polar molecule. You also have a pentameric ring structure with lots of nitrogens and lots of double bond carbons. This part of the compound is a very lipophilic structure, meaning that it's not polarized and it's not water-loving. This is going to be important for later on in the talk about the distribution of the compound. Now, in order to understand how caffeine affects your brain, you have to understand how caffeine gets to your brain. So, let's think about it. How do we ingest caffeine? There are lots of different ways. You have it in your daily coffee. You have it in your 5-hour energy drink. You have it in your soda. It's basically everywhere. And depending upon which substance you intake, gives you a various amount of dose. For instance, 5-hour energy contains anywhere between 214 to 248 milligrams of caffeine, depending upon whether you use regular or extra strength. Coffee has anywhere between 100 and 200 milligrams of caffeine per cup, and that basically varies due to the type of roast that you use. A darker roast often has a higher caffeine concentration than a lighter roast. Chocolate can have anywhere between 10 to 30 milligrams of caffeine in it usually. And soda can also range anywhere between 10 to 280 milligrams of caffeine in it. The 280 milligrams of caffeine often comes from sodas like Jolt or Extra Energy. We know how much we're intaking, and basically the various levels of how much you intake affects the biological effect that you're seeing in your body, meaning the more you take, the more toxic side effects that you may see. So, depending upon what you take, gives you different amounts of caffeine that you're intaking, gives you a different biological effect. It's basic principles of toxicology. The dose makes the poison. Anything is toxic given the amount of dose that you intake. For instance, if you intake enough water, you will die. If you intake enough caffeine, you will die. Same concept. So now you have your 5-hour energy, you have your coffee, you have whatever you're going to intake. How do you intake this? You drink it, or you eat it, depending upon what you have. You never snort it, you never inject it, you don't do that. That means that the caffeine is going down your esophagus, into your stomach, and through your small intestine, and is being absorbed in all of these places. Now, once the caffeine is absorbed through your stomach and in small intestine, it goes directly to your liver. Liver is interesting biologically because that's where most of your breakdown enzymes are located. Caffeine is broken down into different non-active and active forms in your liver, and based off of the degree and amount of metabolic enzymes you have in your liver, going to directly affect how long the caffeine stays in your system. Meaning if you have a lot of metabolic enzyme, you are going to have lower amounts of caffeine, and therefore lower caffeine effects in your body. Whereas if you have high metabolic enzymes, that means you're going to have lower amount of caffeine in your body, and for a decreased in biological response over time. Once the caffeine is absorbed into your body and is in your blood, it's distributed into various places in your body. The main effect, which you guys are interested in, is in the brain. So once the caffeine gets into your blood, which is pretty quick due to the hydrophilic section of the compound, meaning that it's rapidly absorbed in the blood and then distributed quickly to your brain. However, the brain has something called the blood-brain barrier, preventing hydrophilic compounds from entering the brain without certain paperwork. So, what's the compound to do? Fortunately, lipophilic structures can enter in our brain pretty rapidly. So compounds like methamphetamine, cocaine, and caffeine all have lipophilic structures that make it so that it rapidly goes into your brain across the blood-brain barrier. And that's the basic pharmacokinetics of caffeine. For those of you who don't know what pharmacokinetics is, that's the underlying principle of pharmacology toxicology of how the drug gets in your body and where it goes. Pharmacokinetics broken down essentially is ADME. Administration, distribution, metabolism, and elimination. Now, we talked about absorption of caffeine in the fact that it's absorbed in your mouth, into your stomach, in your small intestine, and it goes directly to your liver. We talked about distribution of caffeine, that once it gets to your blood, it's distributed to your brain. The metabolism of caffeine happens in the liver and happens directly after absorption and directly affects the biological activity of caffeine. Elimination we aren't going to talk about too much, but the idea is how fast the compound is eliminated in your kidney. Now, the caffeine is now in our brain. So what happens? What does the caffeine do once it gets to our brain? That principle is called pharmacodynamics, a chemical causing a certain biological action. Now, mechanistically, what happens is caffeine is a competitive inhibitor of the adenosine receptor. Original ligand of the adenosine receptor is adenosine, which is basically how much energy is in your body right now. Adenosine is a fundamental component of adenosine triphosphate, or ATP as it's commonly known. And what ATP is it's the basic unit of energy in our body, meaning how much ATP we have is directly related to how much energy we have in our body, because it's used as energy. So, if there is high adenosine, that means there's a lot of ATP in our system, there's a lot of energy, so there's a lot of adenosine in our systems. It binds to the adenosine receptor, thereby lowering the energy synthesis mechanisms of our cells. So, that ultimately leads to an inhibitory action, silencing everything, calming everything down. However, when we have caffeine come in, it binds to the adenosine receptor in a competitive way, so that means adenosine can't get into the binding pocket. Therefore, you have a decrease of inhibitory response or a stimulatory response. Our body is getting revved up because it doesn't have a signal saying, slow down. A direct result of this competitive inhibition is an effect on our attention. So our attention increases due to this competitive inhibition. However, there are also a lot of peripheral effects due to this competitive inhibition, meaning that there are a lot of indirect effects of this being binding to this adenosine receptor, because the adenosine receptor has a lot of cascading effects that happens after it's been activated. Typically, some of these effects are neurochemical systems of serotonin, dopamine, GABAergic, and glutamic systems. All of these systems are deeply related to reward, alertness, awareness, cognitive thinking, memory, very fundamental behavioral aspects. Ultimately, what it leads to is an immediate increase in alertness and response and awareness. But then it also has a lot of other peripheral long-term side effects due to these altered other neurochemical systems. I'm going to talk briefly about the psychiatric peripheral side effects that occur when you reach a toxic threshold of caffeine. Now, a toxic threshold of caffeine is a certain amount of caffeine in your body to cause toxic side effects. The legal toxic dose of caffeine is 1 gram per 75 kilogram adult. That means you'd have to take about 4 extra strength 5-hour energies to really reach that toxic dose. But this toxic dose is directly related to the acute effects of caffeine, meaning the acute cardiac effects that result in increased heart rate, increased physiological problems, and it doesn't really take into account the behavioral psychiatric effects of caffeine. When you start to see negative behavioral effects of caffeine at about 250 mg per adult. That's literally 1 extra strength 5-hour energy. Some toxic behavioral side effects of caffeine are insomnia, caffeine-induced anxiety, caffeine-induced depression, caffeine-induced mood disorder, caffeine addiction. Not only can caffeine induce these types of disorders, but it can also interact with already pre-existing psychiatric disorders. So somebody can either have induced anxiety, or caffeine can mix with the anxiety and increase the actual anxiety that you're experiencing that you already had, or in some cases it's actually been helpful with people with anxiety. It really depends on your metabolic enzyme genome, or your basic genetic makeup, essentially, and how much you actually intake every day. Basically, how caffeine works in your brain. There's one last thing I kind of wanted to talk about, is how caffeine affects the developing brain, aka how caffeine affects children. There hasn't been a lot of research done in this field, and the studies that have been done are generally 1 quick dose of caffeine, and then looking at the physiological increase in alertness, awareness, and things that we already know happen. Yet to really find a really good long-term study of low doses of caffeine affecting children's cognitive behavior. So I encourage you guys, this is kind of something for you guys to look out for, is try to find a scientific paper on children and long-term doses of caffeine. And if you're not a scientist, then I encourage you to go out in the world and kind of look at the caffeine that kids are consuming, whether it be like soda, chocolate, or even coffee. Figure out how they're consuming it, and then kind of look to see any behavioral effects that you might see. It might be just as subtle as that kid's being a brat and can't control his impulses in public, versus a kid who might not drink soda and not drink coffee, and see how they act. Because I think a huge part of science is obviously observation and then building a hypothesis off of those observations. So I encourage you guys to make observations in your life and form hypotheses that you might think be occurring in a child's brain when they do long-term doses of caffeine. Everything about caffeine on your brain that I have time for today. It's a long video already, so I don't want to talk about it even more. Thanks for watching Daily Dose of Poison. I'm Edward, and tune in next week for a lecture on pain and how it affects your body. Yeah, bye!